Hi, this is Trey Davis, and wanted to introduce myself for the Wyzant public that might be considering piano lessons with me, uh, either online or in person in Houston. Uh, you should know that I'm an instructor at the School of Rock in Houston. I teach piano there and voice, and I'm also a classical piano teacher for Forbes Music Company, which is another online presence that, where I drive out and I meet the students in their homes. And I've taught piano with other online companies in the past, but my background, my formal education is in accounting and taxation. I have an undergraduate degree in accounting and master's degree in taxation, and I'm a CPA in Texas since 1994, and I'm retired from that now. And music was always a big part of my life. I was always very involved in music. I was taken with basically with Chopin when I was a young man, about 11, and studied with Philip Kuhn. He was a Juilliard graduate. He was also a composition student of Nadia Boulanger of France. She's a very famous French composer and pedagogue. She taught people like Philip Glass and just a whole ream of famous musicians. And he studied with her, and he was a fine concert pianist. I also studied with Michael Preddy. Michael Preddy had a master's degree from the University of Houston in conducting. He was a concert pianist, and he was the music director for the Smothers Brothers. And I studied also with Professors Robert Brownlee and Albert Hirsch of the University of Houston, music professors, both concert pianists. And I studied with Joe Locascio, a jazz pianist and jazz composer of very good repute. He's put out over 25 albums, and you can find him on Spotify. And so that's basically the people that I've studied with. I read music, but I had a problem with music. I never understood. With all this classical training and understanding how to read music, I would, I'm 64, and basically I grew up on, pop stars like Elton John and Billy Joel, and these were the people that I kind of admired that played the piano, and I was like, how do they do that? They're not reading music. Who taught them that? What do you do to do that? And there's a big, nasty little secret in the music world, and there's really almost an unconscious taboo. It's not really discussed. The elitist schools like Juilliard and Eastman and Mannes and Manhattan and all the famous, of course, in Europe, all the big famous schools, their whole institutional ideology is to preserve the classical canon of music, Beethoven and Mozart and Bach and Brahms and Schubert and Liszt and all of the Debussy, Ravel, all the famous piano works. I'm talking about piano in particular here, Chopin. Uh, that's the whole thing there, and it's an oral art form, meaning ears. That's the sense that we use, and the sense that a pianist should use to as the filter for how he or she plays. You really need to use your ears, not your eyes. And the ideology for the classical training and the institutional bias on their part, since it's all about preserving the canon, is all about interpreting works. And that's something you read and you use your eyes. And so they're very eye dependent, and which doesn't really make sense because it's an oral art form, right? Uh, you don't have to have eyes to play the piano. You got people like Ray Charles, George Shearing, Art Tatum, Stevie Wonder. I mean, there's a lot of famous blind pianists, and so obviously, and these people have great reputations and are well respected in their own right, even though they're not necessarily classical players. Uh, so how do they do that? They don't have eyes, so they must use their ears, right? Okay, so I want to kind of break down this taboo a little bit because it's not talked about, and I was kind of a victim of it because I was taught by a Juilliard graduate, but I was taught how to read music, but I was never taught. I'm going to use the analogy of a language because this is constantly the analogy used in learning music. Music is language, right? Well, the classical tradition teaches you how to read and write, but it doesn't teach you how to speak it. If you want to, if you want to be fluent, you want to learn how to speak it and not just literate, you've got to go to the jazz artist and the pop artist. And I would cite somebody let's talk about why are they fluent and the classical people aren't. Well, there's no training for fluency in the classical world. They're really not concerned with it. They're concerned about preserving the canon, which is interpreting the works of the major masters in the canon. And that's the whole thing. Now, there is a lot of creativity in interpreting a work, and there is some room for creativity. There's a lot of objectivity in a work. They all play the same notes, right, and probably look at the same sheet music, although there are different editions, you know, people that have edited these works, that you can buy. So there's going to be might be a little bit of variation there. But basically, they're all looking at the same tempo indications, the same dynamic markings, and pedaling. And there could be variations in editions, but for the most part, there's an objective piece of paper, the score, that they read. But even then, they have interpretive leeway, and how do you execute a crescendo? How do you execute a diminuendo? How do you, what's your interpretation of forte? And what are the gradations of the forte within that particular measure, or the gradations of piano? And, every performer brings his own sort of reality to that. And so there's some variation, but a lay person probably may not be that aware of it. But people that are astute and into classical music are aware, and different concert pianists sound very different because there's an intangible aspect of their personality that comes with their tone, which is sort of their character of their personality and how they execute and how they approach the piano. Some people play with flatter fingers like Horowitz did, and supposedly that Russian school had a nicer tone, and some have a more percussive sort of feel with more curved fingers. So there's lots of differences and a lot of creativity within that realm, but they're not into fluency, meaning if we put this in in analogous sort of terms, in like learning a language, they know how to read and they know how to write, but they don't know how to speak it. So, if you're learning French, if you're an English speaker, you're trying to learn French, you don't want to just learn how to read and write it. You want to be able to go to a coffee shop and have a conversation. And what would that require? Well, you'd have to announce yourself. You have to say what your name is. You'd have to make a topic of some kind, state a theme. And then you might have to have a conversation with somebody and respond. And then you might have to develop that theme, and maybe it goes in a different direction. And then maybe you introduce a second theme. And then, and then somehow you'll have to have how to say goodbye and how to close these topics of interest that you're having a discussion with. And maybe a couple of more parties will come into the coffee shop, and you'll have to converse with them and interject their ideas into the conversation pit and roll them all around. And everyone trades sort of a solo in the conversation. And then you'll have to figure out how to end the thing. And those are skills that you don't acquire if you go to the elitist classical schools. Now, if you learn jazz and you spend countless hours and years of study sitting at the piano and trying to be inventive, you can call it meandering, you can call it piddling, you can call it trying things, you can call it being inventive, you can call it being creative. You do something, you see how it works, use your ears as the filter. You listen to it, and then eventually you have sort of an internal realization. It's in your DNA at some point, and you have an inventory of how to respond, of how to initiate an idea, how to develop an idea, how to gradually let that idea fade, and how to end an idea. It's sort of just like a conversation. But the classical people don't learn this. Why? When they go to school, they're very busy, and they're working on very hard works, and they're spending countless hours on interpreting works, or they're spending countless hours on studying theory, or they're spending countless hours playing on ensemble groups. Now, they're going to get, in their theory, they're going to get learn a lot about chords, but they're not going to master chords. They don't have the time, and they don't go in that kind of deep analysis of chords like the jazz and the rock people do. The jazz and the rock people master chords. They spend years and years understanding chords and creating them spontaneously. And they are the jazz and the rock pianist's palette. They're like colors for a painter. They have to know how to mix them quickly and present them and splash them. And so they're giving you these colors, and they know how to, they've created them, and they know what kind of situations require certain sorts of colors and require certain types of chords and bass line interactions with those chords, and they can do it spontaneously. They speak the language, they're fluent. So you want to be literate, the ability to read and write music, and you also want to be fluent or you're not a total musician. So this is a nasty little secret that goes on. And we have sort of these two crowds. The classical people are a little derisive of the jazz and rock people, and they say, they don't have technique. That's their big derisive thing. Their fingers aren't as dexterous as ours are. Well, you look at somebody like Oscar Peterson, he has a lot of dexterity, okay? And then the rock and the jazz people usually say the classical people can't play a thing unless a piece of paper's in front of them. And it's true. I mean, it's really sad. You can go to an elitist school, and there are many that graduate with degrees, and they can't play Happy Birthday for you if you ask them. Or they might say, oh, I haven't practiced. What? You haven't practiced? You got to go practice something before they don't have the fluency. It's sad. Both camps have weaknesses. Both camps have strengths. What we need to do is have a holistic approach so that we have an integrated musician who's both literate and fluent. Now, sometimes the pop and the jazz people are not literate. They're not aware of the canon, the canon, because some of them don't read, although it's becoming more and more common that most jazz artists are very good readers, and they are aware of the canon. A lot of them have a classical background, like Oscar Peterson did, and Chick Corea, and so it's sort of, some of the attacks by either side are generally unwarranted. There have been some crossovers, like Andre Previn, the famous conductor and concert pianist, was a fantastic jazz pianist, but they're kind of rare. So my approach and my quest was, I was fascinated by Billy Joel. How is Billy Joel? Billy Joel dropped out of high school. How does he play the way he plays? Well, he had a band that was really a cover band for Beatles tunes, and he had a classical background. He studied with a teacher, but he stopped reading music because he went in a different way. He went for fluency. He got tired of what he called connecting the dots. And although he could read, and he did a lot of Mozart and a lot of other classical pieces, I'm sure, but then he went into rock and roll, and he had a cover band that really played a lot of Beatles tunes. And you learn a lot when you really apply that kind of time, and you're playing gigs out and you're performing, and you better be pretty good. And you learn how to put a song together and how to develop it. And he had that skill, and that's a musical intelligence. Even though, irrespective, he didn't graduate high school. He didn't need high school to do what he wanted to do. And, well, he's a multimillionaire and a famous rock star. And he's a fluent musician. Later on, he went back into classical music, too, and put out an album that was just classical pieces that he wrote. But anyway, that's the big distinction. And so I've learned how to do that. I went back and studied chords on my own. It took me a year. It took me a solid year. I didn't even really have anybody that could tell me what to do. I went and got a book by Johnny Mehegan, and he used to teach he was a jazz instructor at Juilliard, and he's got a book out that was very good. It was very hard. It had some archaic, kind of arcane and archaic aspects to it. Figured bass, which they really won't use. They won't move to figured bass really in jazz. They want lettered chords. C major instead of Roman numeral 1. C major 7 instead of Roman numeral 1. So it's hard to get people to change over to systems. But that was Johnny Mehegan's big thing. He wanted everybody to do figured bass in jazz and read chords in terms of Roman numerals, like the Nashville system. But anyway, I learned chords. It took me a year. And, all the inversions, there's 204 of them. And, of course, you got to know all your scales, just like the classical pianists have to do. And you have to have good fingers, and you have to have ideas, and you have to spend a lot of time being inventive and creative at the piano and figure out how to keep a song going, so keep it interesting, so somebody might want to listen to it. And so, I can do both of those, and I could teach classical or the more fluent, the pop or the jazz kind of stuff. And I'm going to be cut off here at 15 minutes, and so I'm going to say goodbye. But you can go visit me. I have a YouTube channel called Trey Davis Piano, and you can also find me on Bandmix under Tracy 165, where you can hear me play and sing the piano, play the piano and sing. And on my YouTube channel, I have various videos talking about my background and some interesting anecdotes and other topics of interest in music that you might enjoy. Hope you contact me, and I hope you enjoy your piano, no matter who you study with. Music is a wonderful thing. Bye-bye.